it didn't happen in public. There were no cameras, no formal announcement, just a silent directive issued deep within Kensington Palace. By nightfall, keycards were failing, access codes had been rewritten, and a name once welcomed in royal corridors had quietly vanished from the system. What triggered Prince William's sudden decision to change the palace locks, and why did it lead directly to Queen Camilla? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What makes this moment so striking is not just the action itself, but the silence that surrounded it. According to reports circulating among palace watchers and echoed in fragments by outlets like The Times and commentators such as Robert Hardman, the shift in security protocols came swiftly, almost surgically, as if it had been prepared long before anyone outside a tight inner circle could sense what was coming. There were no leaks in advance, no gradual tightening of rules, just an abrupt recalibration that left even seasoned staff unsettled. Insiders whisper that systems tied to Kensington Palace's internal security network were updated within hours, with clearance levels quietly reassessed and long-standing permissions suddenly revoked. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled, deliberate, and deeply intentional. Those familiar with royal operations describe such a move as highly unusual. Kensington Palace is not just a residence, it is a carefully managed environment where access reflects hierarchy, trust, and proximity to the future of the crown. To alter that structure without public explanation suggests something far more serious than routine maintenance. Various interpretations of the situation suggest that certain individuals connected, however indirectly, to Queen Camilla may have found their access unexpectedly limited. Not publicly named, not formally acknowledged, but quietly removed from the inner framework of movement, privilege that defines palace life. What adds to the tension is the timing. This wasn't an isolated administrative adjustment. Reports suggest it coincided with a series of private discussions involving Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, conversations that insiders describe as intense, focused, and above all, urgent. There is no official record of what was said, but palace administrative streams ranging from security briefings to internal scheduling changes hint at a coordinated response to something that had already raised concern behind closed doors. And at the center of it all stood William, not delegating, not observing from a distance, but personally overseeing the enforcement of the new measures. That detail matters, because William's approach, as described by those familiar with his working style, is rarely impulsive. He is measured, deliberate, and deeply aware of the symbolism behind every decision. For him to step in directly to ensure that every clearance list was updated and every access point re-evaluated suggests that this was not simply about tightening control, it was about drawing a line. A clear, unmistakable boundary that could not be ignored or quietly reversed. And yet the palace remained outwardly calm. No statements, no visible disruption, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. But within that calm, something deeper was unfolding. Staff reportedly adjusted quickly, but not without questions. Why now? Why so suddenly? And why, of all moments, did it appear to intersect, however subtly, with figures connected to Camilla's wider circle? These are questions that, for now, remain unanswered, suspended in a space where speculation thrives but confirmation stays just out of reach. But security changes of this magnitude are never random, they are reactions. And this one, insiders suggest, was triggered by something far more personal than protocol. The discovery wasn't meant to happen not like this. A routine audit, a quiet review of internal access logs, and suddenly, a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. It pointed to movements, permissions, and entries that raised a single, unsettling question. Who had been allowed into spaces they no longer had reason to enter? At first, it appeared almost insignificant, just another internal check, the kind that happens quietly within the operational machinery of Kensington Palace. But reports suggest that as technicians combed through weeks of digital records, something didn't align. Access points had been triggered at unusual hours. Permissions remained active where they should have expired. And most troubling of all, certain credentials appeared to extend far beyond their expected scope. This wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern. And patterns within royal systems are never ignored. Those familiar with palace security protocols describe them as layered, precise, and rarely flexible. Access is not simply granted, it is earned, reviewed, and often restricted, without explanation. So when whispers began circulating that extended privileges might be tied, directly or indirectly, to circles connected to Queen Camilla, the tone shifted instantly. Not publicly, not officially, but internally, where concern doesn't need headlines to carry weight. Various interpretations of these findings suggest that certain individuals retained entry permissions that, under normal circumstances, would have been quietly withdrawn. The question wasn't just how it was, who allowed it to continue. That question, according to insiders, became the turning point. Because within the structure of the royal household, authority over access is tightly controlled. It flows through specific channels, overseen by trusted figures, and rarely bypassed without deliberate intent. So when irregularities surfaced, attention didn't stop at the data, it moved upward, toward the decision-makers. And that's where the atmosphere reportedly changed. Palace insiders describe a growing sense of deep concern, not just about the technical breach itself, but about what it represented. A lapse in protocol is one thing. A lapse in oversight is something else entirely. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal administration that Prince William was briefed directly, with findings laid out in precise, unambiguous terms. There were no assumptions, no speculation, just records, timestamps, and a sequence of events that demanded explanation. And crucially, reports suggest that Catherine, Princess of Wales, was present during at least one of these discussions. That detail, though subtle, carries weight. Because Catherine's involvement signals that this was not merely a logistical issue, it had crossed into something more personal, more sensitive, and far more consequential. What followed, according to those familiar with the situation, was not immediate action, but a moment of quiet reckoning. The kind that happens when information settles, when implications begin to unfold, and when decisions can no longer be delayed. Why had these permissions remained active? Who had authorized their continuation? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was this oversight, or something more intentional? These are questions that, even now, remain suspended in uncertainty, fueling speculation but resisting confirmation. Because within the walls of the monarchy, trust is not just expected, it is the foundation upon which everything else stands. And once that foundation begins to shift, even slightly, the consequences ripple outward in ways that cannot always be contained. What began as a simple audit had uncovered something far deeper, something that could not be quietly filed away or dismissed as routine. It demanded attention, it demanded answers. And most of all, it demanded a response that would redefine the boundaries of access, authority, and control. And what began as a technical anomaly soon evolved into something far more serious, a question of trust at the highest level of the royal household. For years, her influence had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, through carefully maintained relationships and what insiders call domestic diplomacy. Queen Camilla had secured a presence across royal spaces that extended far beyond expectation. But had that reach gone too far? What makes this question so unsettling is not the visibility of her influence, but the way it seemed to operate just beneath the surface, never formally declared, yet widely acknowledged among those who navigate the inner workings of the royal household. Reports suggest that Queen Camilla had, over time, cultivated a network that extended into administrative corridors, private offices, and even informal advisory circles. It wasn't power in the traditional sense. It didn't come with titles or official mandates. Instead, it moved through relationships, trusted aides, long-standing confidants, and connections that blurred the line between personal loyalty and institutional authority. Insiders whisper that this network functioned with remarkable subtlety. Decisions were rarely traced directly back to her, yet her presence was often felt in outcomes that seemed to align with her interests. Invitations, access permissions, introductions, small details that, when viewed individually, appeared routine, but when examined together, painted a far more complex picture. Various interpretations suggest that extended family connections, including figures tied to her own lineage, may have benefited from this quiet expansion of influence. Not overtly, not in ways that could be easily challenged, but enough to raise questions among those who understood how tightly controlled such privileges are meant to be. And this is where tension began to build. Because within the royal structure, influence is expected to follow a defined hierarchy. It is shaped by protocol, reinforced by tradition, and carefully balanced to avoid precisely this kind of overlap. So when informal, authority begins to stretch beyond those boundaries, it doesn't go unnoticed, especially by those tasked with protecting the future of the institution. Those familiar with Prince William and his approach to royal duty describe him as deeply committed to clarity, structure, and discipline. For him, ambiguity is not a strength, it is a vulnerability. Historical friction between William's inner circle and Camilla's extended network has been hinted at before, though never openly acknowledged. Different interpretations of past interactions suggest moments of quiet disagreement, subtle resistance, and a growing divergence in how each side views the role of influence within the monarchy. William's vision, as insiders describe it, leans toward a streamlined, tightly governed institution. Camilla's approach, shaped by years of navigating complex personal dynamics, appears more fluid, more relational, and at times, less bound by rigid protocol. That contrast, while manageable for a time, may have reached a tipping point. Palace insiders describe a growing discomfort among senior staff and an unease that didn't erupt into conflict, but lingered in conversations, in cautious decisions, in the careful way certain topics were approached. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about awareness. A recognition that something within the system was shifting, expanding, and perhaps moving beyond the boundaries that had long kept the institution stable. And when that awareness intersected with the findings from the audit, the unusual access patterns, the extended permissions, the unanswered questions, the narrative began to change. What once seemed like harmless influence now carried different implications. Not necessarily intentional, not definitively improper, but undeniably significant. Because in a system built on precision and control, even the smallest deviation can signal something much larger beneath the surface. Because influence, when left unchecked, can blur boundaries, and in this case, those boundaries may have been crossed in ways that forced a response. There comes a moment when quiet concern turns into decisive action, and for Prince William, that moment had arrived. According to palace whispers, the future king didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The order was clear, final, and impossible to misinterpret. What followed was not chaos, not confusion, but precision. Reports suggest that Prince William moved with a level of control that left little room for hesitation. Within hours of being briefed on the irregularities, instructions were issued through tightly guarded channels. Security teams, already accustomed to discipline, were told to initiate what insiders describe as an immediate lockdown protocol. Not a visible shutdown, not something that would alarm the outside world, but an internal recalibration so exact, so thorough, that every layer of access would be reevaluated from the ground up. It was, in many ways, a silent reset of the palace's internal order. Those familiar with the process describe a sweeping review that touched every corner of Kensington Palace's operational system. Access cards were deactivated and reissued. Entry logs were scrutinized in real time. Permissions that had once been taken for granted were suddenly subject to strict justification. The phrase "need to enter" began circulating among staff not as a suggestion but as a rule. A line drawn with unmistakable clarity. If access could not be explained, it would not be allowed. And in a structure where access equals trust, the implications were immediate and profound. But perhaps the most telling aspect of this response was not the technology, not the systems, but the people. Reports indicate that several senior aides found their roles quietly adjusted, their responsibilities reshaped in ways that reflected a new hierarchy of trust. Some were reassigned, others repositioned, not as punishment, but as part of what insiders describe as a broader effort to reinforce control. It wasn't about blame, it was about structure. A tightening of the framework that governs who belongs where and who does not. And standing alongside William, according to various interpretations of the situation, was Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her presence, though rarely highlighted in official narratives, is said to have carried quiet weight during these moments. Insiders whisper that she supported the decision, not with public statements or visible intervention, but through alignment, a shared understanding of what was at stake. Because for both of them, this was not just about correcting an internal issue. It was about protecting the integrity of the institution they are expected to lead. The move itself has been described by those close to palace operations as firm but necessary. Not dramatic, not reckless, but decisive. A response shaped not by emotion, but by responsibility. Yet beneath that controlled exterior, the tension remained. Because actions like this, no matter how justified, do not exist in a vacuum. They send signals. They create shifts. And perhaps most importantly, they force others within the system to reassess their own positions, their own influence, and their own place within the evolving structure of royal power. What makes this moment so significant is not just the enforcement of new rules, but the message embedded within them. That access is not permanent, that influence has limits, and that even the most established connections can be reevaluated when the balance begins to tilt too far. These are not small adjustments, they are foundational shifts, the kind that redefine how authority is exercised and how trust is maintained. And as the palace adjusted to this new reality, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a wider ripple, one that would extend beyond systems and protocols, reaching into relationships that had long been considered stable. Because when power is reasserted so decisively, it does more than correct, it transforms. But decisions like this don't exist in isolation, they ripple outward, affecting not just systems, but relationships at the very core of the monarchy. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Conversations became guarded, movements more deliberate, and long-standing alliances suddenly uncertain. Something had changed and everyone could feel it. What had begun as a controlled security adjustment now revealed its deeper impact not through announcements, but through behavior. Reports suggest that staff who once moved with quiet confidence now hesitated, double-checking permissions, second-guessing instructions, and navigating a structure that no longer felt as predictable as it once had. There was no panic, no visible disorder, but an undercurrent of uncertainty that spread quickly through the corridors of Kensington Palace. It was subtle, almost invisible to the outside world, yet impossible to ignore for those within it. Because when access is redefined, so too is the balance of trust. Insiders whisper that communication channels, once fluid and informal, began to tighten. Messages that would have previously moved quickly between departments were now delayed, filtered, or quietly halted altogether. Some describe this as a freeze, not an official shutdown, but a deliberate slowing of information flow. A pause that forced everyone to reconsider what could be shared, with whom, and under what authority. It wasn't just about security anymore. It was about control. And control in an environment built on hierarchy carries its own weight. Within this shifting landscape, particular attention turned toward those believed to be connected to Queen Camilla. Various interpretations suggest that individuals once considered part of an extended inner circle found themselves increasingly distant from key discussions. Not publicly excluded, not formally removed, but quietly sidelined in ways that spoke volumes without saying anything at all. Invitations became less frequent, access points narrowed, and influence once assumed began to feel uncertain. For those accustomed to proximity, the change was unmistakable. At the same time, senior members of the royal family were reportedly briefed under conditions of strict confidentiality. Details remained scarce, as they often do in matters of this nature, but sources close to royal correspondents like Ingrid Seward suggest that the tone of these briefings was serious, measured, and carefully controlled. There was no room for speculation within those rooms, only information delivered with the understanding that its implications would not extend beyond a tightly guarded circle. And yet, despite that control, something began to seep outward. Media insiders, always attuned to shifts within the monarchy, started to pick up on subtle signals. Not direct confirmations, not explicit leaks, but patterns. A change in scheduling here, an unexpected absence there, a noticeable adjustment in who appeared where and with whom. These fragments, when pieced together, began to form a narrative that could not be easily dismissed. Something was happening, something deliberate, and while the full picture remained hidden, the outlines were becoming harder to ignore. Those within the palace have described this period as a quiet internal reset. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, but a recalibration. A moment in which the structure of influence, access, and authority was being subtly but firmly redefined. And yet, for all its quiet precision, the emotional impact lingered. Because behind every adjustment, every reassignment, every unspoken shift, There were individuals trying to understand what it meant for them and for the future of the institution they serve. And as this new reality settled in, the tension did not disappear. It deepened. Because beneath the controlled surface, beneath the careful silence, there remained a question that refused to fade. A question that reached beyond systems and protocols into something far more profound. Yet beneath the surface tension, a deeper question remained: was this simply about access or something far more symbolic? At its core, this wasn't just about doors or keycards, it was about boundaries. Who belongs where, who holds influence, and who ultimately defines the limits of royal authority in a changing monarchy. Because beneath the technical language of access logs and clearance levels, a deeper struggle had been unfolding, one that insiders suggest has been quietly shaping the direction of the royal family for years. Reports indicate that what we are witnessing now is not an isolated reaction, but the visible edge of a long-standing tension between tradition and a more modern, controlled vision of monarchy. On one side stands a system rooted in relationships, legacy ties, and informal influence. On the other, a structure that demands clarity, discipline, and sharply defined lines of authority. And somewhere between those two forces, the balance had begun to shift. Those familiar with Prince William describe his approach as deliberate and forward-looking, shaped by an awareness that the monarchy must evolve to survive. Not through dramatic reinvention, but through refinement, a careful stripping away of ambiguity in favor of precision. A streamlined institution, where roles are clearly defined, access is tightly controlled, and influence is no longer something that expands quietly in the background. For William, this is not just preference. It is necessity. Because in a world where scrutiny is constant, even the smallest inconsistency can become a point of vulnerability. But that vision does not exist in isolation. It intersects sometimes uneasily with established dynamics that have long defined how the royal household operates. Various interpretations suggest that overlapping spheres of influence have created moments of quiet friction, particularly where informal authority begins to blur into official territory. The presence of figures connected to Queen Camilla within certain operational spaces has, according to insiders, raised questions not about intent, but about boundaries. Where does personal connection end and institutional authority begin? And who has the final say when those lines become unclear? History offers echoes of this kind of tension. The royal family has, on more than one occasion, faced internal struggles over influence, access, and control, moments where competing visions of the monarchy collided behind closed doors. While each situation is unique, the underlying theme remains consistent: the need to protect the structure of the institution, even when doing so requires difficult decisions. Insiders now frame this current moment as a defining point, not because of its scale, but because of what it represents. A shift in how authority is asserted, and how far that authority is willing to go to maintain order. At the heart of it all lies a simple but powerful idea: control versus access. Access can be granted, expanded, and if necessary, withdrawn. But control is something else entirely. It defines the rules, sets the limits, and ultimately determines who operates within the system and who stands outside it. What the recent actions suggest is that control is being reasserted with a level of clarity that leaves little room for interpretation. And in doing so, it sends a message that extends far beyond the immediate situation. Because once boundaries are redrawn, they do not easily return to their previous state. They reshape expectations. They redefine relationships. And perhaps most importantly, they establish a precedent for how similar situations will be handled in the future. For those within the palace, this is not just a moment to observe, it is a moment to understand. To recognize that the structure they operate within is evolving, and that their place within it may no longer be as fixed as it once seemed. And as these lines were redrawn, the implications stretched far beyond palace walls into the very future of the crown. At the center of it all stands King Charles, a monarch balancing duty, loyalty, and an increasingly fragile personal landscape. And as tensions rise between his son and his wife, the pressure on him has never been greater. Because while the decisions unfolding within Kensington Palace carried the unmistakable imprint of Prince William's authority, reports suggest that King Charles III was not the one who initiated them. Various interpretations indicate he was informed after key actions had already been set. In motion, a detail that adds a layer of quiet complexity to an already delicate situation. Not excluded, not sidelined, but positioned in a way that reflects the evolving balance of power within the monarchy. It is a subtle shift, but one that carries profound implications. For Charles, this moment is not simply institutional, it is deeply personal. On one side stands his heir, the future of the crown, asserting control with clarity and conviction. On the other stands Queen Camilla, his partner, whose presence within the royal structure has, over time, become both influential and, according to some insiders, increasingly scrutinized. To stand between them is not merely a matter of leadership, it is a test of loyalty, of judgment, and of the ability to hold together forces that are quietly pulling in different directions. And all of this unfolds against the backdrop of his own health concerns, which have been widely acknowledged since early 2024. While official updates remain measured, those familiar with royal dynamics suggest that these circumstances add a sense of urgency to everything else. Stability is no longer an abstract goal, it is an immediate necessity. Every decision, every tension, every unresolved question carries greater weight, because the margin for prolonged uncertainty has narrowed. The monarchy cannot afford sustained internal strain, and Charles, more than anyone, understands that. Historically, he has often taken on the role of mediator within the family, a figure who seeks balance, who absorbs tension rather than amplifies it. Reports from royal commentators, such as Ingrid Seward, suggest that this instinct remains intact, even now. But the nature of this situation is different. It is not a disagreement that can be resolved through conversation alone. It is structural, systemic, and rooted in questions of authority that cannot easily be negotiated away. And that leaves Charles in a position where his usual approach may no longer be sufficient. Insiders whisper of what they describe as a quiet acceptance. Not resignation, not indifference, but an understanding that certain actions, once taken, cannot be undone without consequence. That the direction being set by William reflects not just a momentary response, but a broader vision for the future of the monarchy. And that intervening too forcefully could risk creating fractures that are far more damaging than the tensions currently unfolding. So instead, efforts appear to be focused behind the scenes, maintaining unity where possible, ensuring that communication, however limited, remains intact, managing perceptions both within the palace and beyond it, with the kind of care that has long defined royal survival. It is a balancing act, one that requires restraint as much as action, silence as much as guidance. And yet, even with those efforts, the strain is unmistakable. Because when the forces at play are this deeply rooted, even the most careful mediation can only do so much. And as the situation continues to evolve, one truth becomes increasingly difficult to ignore: that not every conflict within the monarchy can be resolved through compromise. Some require decisions, others demand boundaries, and a few, perhaps the most difficult of all, unfold in a space where resolution is not immediate but gradual, shaped over time by choices that cannot be reversed. But even a king cannot always hold opposing forces together, and sometimes silence speaks louder than intervention. In the end, no announcement was made, no statement released. Yet within palace walls, the message was unmistakable. Something had shifted. The rules had changed, and the future of royal power might now look very different from its past. What began as a quiet adjustment, subtle, almost invisible, had now settled into something far more permanent. Reports suggest that the decisions set in motion by Prince William were never intended to be temporary measures. They were structural, deliberate, designed not just to address a moment of concern, but to establish a new baseline for how authority operates within the royal household. And as days turned into weeks, that baseline began to solidify. Access remained restricted, protocols stayed firm, and the sense that something fundamental had changed only grew stronger. For those within the palace, the implications became clearer with time. Hierarchy, once softened by familiarity and long-standing relationships, was now reinforced with renewed precision, not harshly, not publicly, but unmistakably. Insiders describe an environment where roles are more clearly defined, where expectations are more strictly enforced, and where the margin for ambiguity has been significantly reduced. It is not a return to the past, but neither is it a continuation of what came before. It is something else entirely, a recalibrated structure that reflects a different vision of control. Within that structure, the position of Queen Camilla appears, according to various interpretations, to have been subtly but meaningfully redefined. Not diminished in title, not publicly altered in status, but adjusted in influence. The kind of shift that does not announce itself, yet becomes evident through absence, through distance, through the quiet narrowing of spaces once more accessible. It is not confrontation. It is repositioning. And in a system where proximity often equals power, that repositioning carries weight. At the same time, the palace itself is described by insiders as entering what they call a new phase. A period marked not by instability but by consolidation. Discipline has taken precedence. Structure has become the guiding principle. And beneath it all lies a clear intention to ensure that the institution remains resilient, controlled, and aligned with the expectations of a future that will demand even greater scrutiny. This is not simply about internal order. It is about preparing for what comes next. Because the monarchy, as history has shown, does not remain static. It evolves, often quietly, often behind closed doors, shaped by decisions that are rarely explained in real time. What we are witnessing now, according to those who follow these developments closely, may well be one of those moments. A turning point not defined by public spectacle, but by internal recalibration. A shift that will only be fully understood in hindsight when its consequences have had time to unfold. And within that unfolding lies a deeper question, one that extends beyond individuals, beyond relationships, and into the very nature of royal authority itself. Who sets the boundaries? Who enforces them? And how far can those boundaries be pushed before they are redrawn entirely? These are not questions with immediate answers, but they are questions that will shape the path forward, long after the current tension has settled into silence. Because in the House of Windsor, power is rarely taken, it is quietly, decisively redefined. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.